Hey, how's it going? Dave here, and welcome to part 2 of my Basic Music Theory for Guitar Players video series. If you're completely new to music theory and you haven't seen my previous video, I highly recommend you go and check that out. But if you're up to speed with the 12 notes of Western music, sharps and flats, or you've already seen that video, then stick around. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about intervals, basically assigning names and numbers to the 12 notes we went over in the last video. But just before we dive into that, I just want to quickly go over the terms tone and semitone, or you might also hear them referred to as whole steps and half steps. Now they both mean the exact same thing, just two different terminologies. But you'll likely hear both of them used a lot throughout your musical journey, so let's really make sure we understand what both of them mean. Now in the last video we covered the concept of sharps and flats, and how a note with a sharp next to it could be thought of as that note but slightly higher in pitch. For example, A sharp could be thought of as A but slightly higher. It's a great way to begin getting your head around the terms and how it works, but at some point we need to actually understand how those notes relate to each other and the differences between them. And this is where we use the terms tones and semitones, or whole steps and half steps. So tones and semitones are used to communicate a movement and a distance between two notes. You can move up in pitch by a tone or a semitone. You could also move down in pitch by a tone or a semitone. I'm going to start by explaining this in an upwards direction, so let's jump to a keyboard to help us get a bit of a better visual understanding. So if we take the note A, if we wanted to move a semitone or a half step above that A note, we would land on A sharp. And that A sharp is the closest note possible to A going up in pitch. So a semitone or a half step is the smallest distance between two notes, and therefore the smallest movement we can make. So on a guitar, if we take any note, let's say A, 5th fret, the low E string, to go up a semitone to A sharp, we'd simply go up by 1 fret. If we want to go down 1 semitone, we just go down 1 fret. As another example, let's take the note C. A semitone or a half step above C would be C sharp. It's the closest note possible to C moving up in pitch. One more, and this one will test you on what we learned in the last video. So we'll start on E. If we go up in pitch by a semitone or a half step, what note will we land on? Or what's the closest note possible to E going up in pitch? It will be F, not E sharp, because remember, there isn't a note in between E and F. And we can see that on our keyboard here. Here's E, and here's F. There isn't a note or a black key between them. So again, going up a semitone from E would take us to F. F is the closest ascending note possible to E. Now let's talk about tones or whole steps. A tone or a whole step is basically the distance or movement of two semitones. So let's go back to our examples, but this time using tones or whole steps. So taking the note A, if we went up by a whole step, we would land on B. A half step would take us to A sharp. If a whole step is 2 half steps, then that would take us to B. Next example was C. If we go up a whole step from C, we get D. Half step from C to C sharp, and another half step from C sharp to D. So if we go back to our E note, knowing that there is no note between E and F, what note would be a whole step above E? The answer is F sharp. E to F would be a half step, so a whole step above E would be F sharp. I hope that makes sense. This is where we start getting into intervals, because you could look at a half step as the smallest possible interval and a whole step as the second smallest possible interval. So let's define what we mean by interval. So an interval means the space or the distance between a root note and another note. And intervals are the foundation of both harmony and melody. So we can use a knowledge of intervals to construct scales and chords. Now there are two core types of interval: melodic intervals and harmonic intervals. Two notes played in sequence would be considered a melodic interval, and two different notes played at the same time in unison would be considered a harmonic interval, which is essentially a chord. And in music, we describe various intervals using numbers, unison meaning first note or root note. After that, we have second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, eighth meaning octave. We also describe various intervals by their quality. Those qualities are major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. So let's break that down and try and make sense of it. So let's go back to our 12 notes using sharps. Starting on A, we've got A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp. There's our 12 notes using sharps. Now there's only one scale that can contain all 12 notes, and that's called the chromatic scale. So you might be thinking now, why are we talking about scales all of a sudden? Well, the chromatic scale is just another way of saying all the notes. And because it contains every possible note, it also contains every possible interval. So the chromatic scale is actually going to be the foundation of what we're going to talk about next, naming the intervals. Now because it's the chromatic scale and it contains all possible notes, it can't have a fixed key, so it doesn't really matter where you start it from. However, where you start will determine the interval of each note, because we're always identifying intervals in relation to a root note. Being as we've been learning the musical alphabet, let's start from A. So let's take our chromatic scale starting from A. So A is our root note or our starting note, and all the intervals we're going to be talking about are named in relation to A, our root note. Any note can be a root note, but it's really important that you understand that intervals are named in relation to a root note. A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp. And then finally back to A, one octave up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 notes. So starting from A, this is our root note or tonic. Open A string, or 5th fret of the low E string. Our first and smallest possible interval is called a minor second. In this case, it runs from A to B flat. Our next interval is called a major second, between A and B. Now we move into thirds, and we have an interval of a minor third, A to C. Next is a major third between A and C sharp. Now so far we've covered major and minor intervals. We've had a minor second, minor third, and major third. The next interval is actually neither major or minor, so we call it a perfect fourth. And in this case, the perfect fourth interval is between A and D. Next we have a pretty weird sounding interval called the diminished fifth. It has a very dark, kind of spooky sound to it, which makes it pretty easy to recognise. And the diminished fifth is between A and D sharp. Little fact for you, centuries ago the diminished fifth used to be referred to as the devil's interval or the devil's tritone because they thought it sounded really dark and evil. And if you were ever caught playing this in a church, you would literally have your head cut off. No joke. Anyway, so the next interval is called a perfect fifth. Again, it has a very neutral sound, neither major or minor, and it runs between A and E. So now we're back to major and minor intervals, and the next interval is called a minor sixth, from A to F. After the minor sixth, we have a major sixth between A and F sharp. Moving on to sevenths now, our next interval is a minor seventh, and that runs from A to G. To Two more to go, nearly there. Our next interval is a major seventh between A and G sharp. And finally, the interval we talked about a lot in the last video, and the largest possible interval, an octave. And that is, of course, A to A. A to B flat minor second. A to B major second. A to C minor third. A to C sharp major third. Perfect fourth, A to D. A to D sharp diminished fifth. A to E perfect fifth. A to F minor sixth. A to F sharp major sixth. A to G minor seventh. A to G sharp major seventh. And finally A to A, an octave. Okay, so we've covered all the intervals. There are a few different terminologies for each kind of interval. You might hear them referred to in a few different ways. Now, I'm not going to get into that in this video purely because I think it's more beneficial to first understand how intervals work and what they are before you start filling your head with all the different names. But I have created a PDF document covering all the different terminologies that you might hear. So if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link down below in the description. Okay, so that's all for this lesson. I hope it made sense. If you really want to get the hang of it, try using a couple of different root notes. Take your root note and move up by one semitone or half step at a time, and just assign the correct interval name for each note. And hopefully you'll get the hang of it pretty quick. But remember, it's really important to just take your time, soak in all the information and really understand it. You're going to thank yourself in the long run for sure, especially when we start looking at scales and chords. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and not too overwhelming. If you enjoyed it and you'd like to support the channel, please subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care, guys.